The great civilization of ancient Egypt, with its dramatic spectacle and mystery, has always fascinated me. I've been travelling the country to explore some of the intriguing stories that have emerged from this historic land. In this programme, I'm on the trail of a pharaoh's wife who committed a crime so terrible they tried to wipe her name from history. This is the body of Ramesses III. He came to the throne in around 1184 BC, about 30 years after the death of his illustrious namesake, Ramesses II. He's considered by many to be the last of the truly great pharaohs, and he went to enormous lengths to ensure his achievements would be remembered. Many pharaohs left monuments in stone as witness to their greatness. They carved their life stories on a scale never seen before. And Ramesses III truly seemed worthy to follow his noble predecessors. Generations to follow would know of his glory and power because his temples and statues boast of huge wealth and impressive military victories. But thanks to a chance discovery of ancient documents, we can go behind the propaganda of Ramesses III to reveal a very different pharaoh from the one he wanted the world to know. Hidden for 3,000 years, these papyri tell a story that was never supposed to be remembered. A story of betrayal and intrigue against a flawed pharaoh. It's sheer luck that this document has survived to tell the tale. This is Medinet Habu, one of the largest and best preserved temples of its time in Egypt. It was built for Ramesses III, and it's more of a temple town really, not just a place for the gods, but a centre for civil administration and a place of refuge in time of trouble. I've come here to understand the two different sides of the life of Ramesses III, the public propaganda and the scandalous hidden story. Within these walls, a powerful drama was played out over 3,000 years ago that completely changes how we think about this great pharaoh. To judge by the mighty scale of this temple and the images on it, you'd think he was the most successful pharaoh of all time. Here he is smiting his enemies, whipping them, almost like a fertility god, a virility personified. But towards the end of his reign, Ramesses was beleaguered, beset, few allies nearby. Civil disobedience undermined the stability of his reign, and also he died in strange and mysterious circumstances. But you wouldn't know any of that from the images carved here. Ramesses ordered this enormous temple to be constructed on the very first day of his reign. He must have believed from the start that there would be plenty of glorious military triumphs to carve upon these vast walls, that he would be one of the greatest pharaohs that ever lived. On the walls of the second court of the temple are some very gory details celebrating the pharaoh's military triumphs. Up there are piles of severed hands, each one of course representing a dead enemy, and the hands are being counted by scribes. There's a chap throwing the hands onto the pile. There's 1, 2, 3 piles of severed hands, and in front of me is a pile of severed penises. Again, each one representing an enemy who could no longer pose a threat. And this is incredible. Below me here is a hieroglyph explaining the scenes above. This surely is a text referring to the severed penises. And there we see a hieroglyph for a severed enemy penis, I suppose. How about that?
At the time of Ramesses III, Egypt was surrounded by enemies. He was fighting to save his country from invasion. Although, to judge from the depictions on one of the most impressive walls, the pharaoh easily swept aside his foes.
The outer surface of the temple wall shows one of the most extraordinary artistic scenes in Egyptian art. It is probably the first, certainly the largest depiction of a naval battle in history. An amazing piece of work. In front of me here, one sees the swirl of a chaotic naval action. And here we see ships being boarded, grappling hooks, pulling ships over. An amazing image of violence, terror and fighting. Here is the image of the pharaoh, Ramesses III, in all his power and glory. Gigantic figure dominating the scene with his great bow, clearly directing the actions, making it clear that he was responsible for the Egyptian victory that was the result of this action. Propaganda of a very high order.
But Ramesses wasn't only proud of his military prowess. He also seems to have been unusually proud of his harem of women. All pharaohs had many wives who lived in royal harems all over the country. But Ramesses clearly took particular delight in depicting himself with his women.
I'm in the temple gatehouse, and above me are the remains of a most extraordinary room, a prospect room, where the pharaoh would sit, enjoying the view to the Nile over there and the canal that once served the temple. But he'd sit up there with the young females, presumably females from the harem, which is somewhere over there, I think. We know this because the images show the pharaoh sitting with a young girl, chucking her under the chin, conversing in a casual manner, and up there with another delightful female. These are almost unprecedented in Egyptian art, these scenes of the pharaoh with his concubines. Striking, but they have now a strange poignancy because we know it was women such as these, women closest to Ramesses, who were to plot his downfall, his murder.
We only know about the dark goings-on that happened here because of that chance discovery of an extraordinary set of documents. In the early 19th century, a bundle of papyri dating from the reign of Ramesses III turned up on the black market in Cairo. Papyrus is fragile, disintegrates easily, and some pages were missing. But enough of these legal and administrative documents survived to suggest a remarkable tale. The details are disputed amongst historians because some of the text is confusing and difficult to interpret. But piecing together the fragments, what has emerged is a story so scandalous that the ancient Egyptians tried to wipe it from history. In fact, they almost succeeded, because this papyrus is the only evidence that these events ever took place. The documents tell the story of an extraordinary conspiracy against the pharaoh that centered around his innermost circle, his harem. The last place he would have expected betrayal. In ancient Egypt, the harem was an important part of the pharaoh's court, with unprecedented access to the pharaoh himself. The harem housed the royal wives and concubines and their many children, as well as male administrators, treasurers, and the pharaoh's household staff. Because the pharaoh often married into the most aristocratic Egyptian families, the harem could contain the sisters, mothers and daughters of some of the most important people in Egypt. Each pharaoh had several harems in palaces and temples around the country, sometimes adding up to hundreds of wives and concubines. But he would also have a travelling harem of his favourites that went everywhere with him. Within these various harems, there must have been quite a bit of jockeying for position amongst the women, hoping for favour for themselves and their offspring. The papyrus suggests that it was in this world of domestic and political intrigue that Ramesses III demonstrated his major failing, his inability to organise his private life. It appears that as his reign went on, this pharaoh, far from continuing the glorious traditions of his predecessors, was becoming a weak, indecisive man, unable to control his own family, let alone his nation. And some historians believe this failing is confirmed in a curious detail here at Medinet Habu.
Ramesses III was, it seems, a man who was unable to make decisions, even very important decisions. All pharaohs had numerous wives, but each pharaoh would choose a great wife, and that was done for a very simple reason. It was a great wife who would give birth to the next pharaoh. Through her, the line of succession was assured, and no one would argue. Her child was to rule after the death of the pharaoh. But Ramesses couldn't choose between two women. One was Isis, and the other contender was Ti, two women. And this picture here tells a tale. We see up there an image with Ramesses to the left, and in front of him, slightly above, the great queen. But she hasn't been named. The cartouche in front of her, which should bear her name in hieroglyphics, is blank. This indecision was terrible. It created chaos within the court when there should be order, and set up a potential succession crisis.
The competition between these two royal wives, Ti and Isis, must have been fierce. Ti gave birth to a son called Pentawarret, which means son of the great female one. But Isis also had a son of about the same age. In Egypt, it was by no means automatic that the elder son would be chosen to inherit the throne. So to avoid a succession crisis, Ramesses absolutely had to choose which of these two sons was to become the crown prince. And when he finally made his decision, Ramesses did not choose Ti's son, Pentawarret. Instead, he chose Isis's son. And from the papyrus, we know that this decision was to have potentially fatal repercussions for the pharaoh. Ti was not the kind of woman to be passed over lightly. From the documents, it appears she soon began to plot her revenge and hatched an audacious plan to put her own son on the throne. It appears there were two parts to Ti's plot. The first was to murder her husband, Ramesses III. The second, to provoke an armed uprising, to prevent Isis's son from taking his rightful place as pharaoh. The papyrus tells us extraordinary details of who was involved in the plot. For a start, Ti recruited those closest to the pharaoh, the harem women. This is an exact replica of a portion of the papyrus. And here's Ti's name mentioned here. This tells us that she conspired with the head of the harem and with the women of the harem to incite rebellion against Ramesses. She must have been a pretty compelling person, because she persuaded some of the most important and trusted men of the royal household to side with her against the pharaoh and his rightful heir. Not only the head of the harem, but the treasurer, the butlers, and, significantly, the food taster. But the help of these powerful courtiers alone wouldn't be enough. T still had to convince key generals in the army to commit treason, to betray their pharaoh and join her plot. We know from this extraordinary document that T and her allies began writing letters to friends and family outside the harem, asking them to join the conspiracy. And because many of the harem women came from powerful families, they were closely related to high-ranking officials in the army and in politics. If the women of the harem could recruit enough important friends and relatives, then this conspiracy could be very dangerous for the pharaoh. But there's a curious part of this document that gives us an added insight into the general atmosphere of superstition that pervaded the court of Ramesses III. Ramesses was a great believer in the power of magic. In fact, most people in ancient Egypt accepted that magic could be used to affect the lives of the living for good or for ill. Although spells were thought to be the key to achieving the required result, sometimes the magic also involved administering narcotics. And we know from the papyrus that T and her co-conspirators used Ramesses' own spells to help them in their plan. Ramesses' own library contained many papyri packed with detailed spells, and it was one of these spells that was stolen by a scribe and given to the plotters to be used against Ramesses himself. It was probably a crime punishable by death even to read the spells in the pharaoh's private library, let alone steal one and hand it over to the pharaoh's enemies to give them power over him. But this is what the papyrus says about one of the daring plotters. He began to make magic spells for hindering and terrifying, and to make people out of wax for enfeebling the limbs, and gave them into the hands of the head of the harem in order to hinder the guards. This wax figurine, a doll really, dates from after the time of Ramesses, but is much like those used during his reign. It would have represented an individual. The head here, the arm of course, and the navel. There's a little sort of twist of hair, I suppose taken from the person who would have been the subject of the spell. Don't know much about the person, other than seemingly was a man, sort of genitals popping up here, made of wax, so one could, I suppose, stick pins in it if one didn't like the person, and back, this little recess in which there is a bit of papyrus on which the spell is written, except it can't be read now, it's too fragile. It would have been over a figure just like this that the priests cast T's spell, one of which was aimed at incapacitating the guards around the temple so the plotters could send letters out into the land to raise rebellion against Ramesses. We know that by now, T had successfully recruited many key military leaders to her plot, including the command of the archers and army generals. But the conspirators would need to choose their moment carefully, and events were beginning to play into their hands. Ramesses, now in declining health, had begun to lose popularity amongst his subjects because of a series of disastrous political decisions. Civil unrest against the pharaoh began to spread through Egypt. One of the key events happened here, in Thebes. In the 29th year of Ramesses' reign, a crisis overtook the country. Government workers failed to receive their wages, and this was a very serious matter since their wages were paid in the form of food. What did they do? Well, they took direct action. They waited 2 weeks and then went on strike. They marched down here to the Ramesseum to confront the scribes. They came here because the Ramesseum is not just a mortuary temple, but also as a centre of local administration, and it's where food was stored. This is where their wages were. They came here to go to the warehouses over there to take
their wages, to take their food. The workers must have prowled around here, outside these warehouses, looking for their food, demanding their wages.
The reason why the food had not been handed out was because, ironically, Ramesses was storing up the grain for a big feast to celebrate the 30th anniversary of his glorious reign. But, in fact, his reign was becoming more and more troubled, and Ti and her co-conspirators must have been watching with interest.
The discontent went on for months, and if this was the state of affairs here with the government workers in Thebes, one can only assume this was the state of affairs throughout the country, other workers also not receiving their wages. The country must have been tottering on the edge of insurrection, a difficult and dangerous place, tottering on the edge of chaos.
This chaos would eventually provide the ideal conditions for an uprising against the pharaoh. And Ti's plan was ready to glide into action. The details are unclear, but it seems that Ti launched her plot during the next big festival held in Medinet Habu. And just 3 weeks later, Ramesses III was dead. This extraordinary story makes me see the whole temple complex of Medinet Habu afresh. It's as though it were a crime scene.
I'm standing on top of the first pylon, and from up here, get a very clear feel for the geography of Medinet Habu. Over there is the entrance gateway.
And that's where the spells, possibly drugs, must have been used to incapacitate the guards.
Behind me is the temple proper, with its courtyards and second pylon.
During the festival, this would have been packed with courtiers and guests, the perfect cover for Ti's plot.
In front of me here, the ruins of the royal palace.
And presumably, it was in one of the rooms down there that Ramesses III died. Thanks to mummification, we can still see the body of the pharaoh today, over 3,000 years after his death.
Golly, to come face to face with Ramesses at last. Incredible. What we know is that he died about a month after the harem plot. So it seems likely that he was murdered, that the plotters succeeded in their aims of killing the pharaoh.
If there were a forensic investigation, this mummy would be dissected and analysed to tell us what happened to him. But as it stands, there's no conclusive evidence to prove the crime.
What we don't know is how he died. His body has never been fully examined. The head's been x-rayed, and we know it shows no trauma. He wasn't hit on the head, for example, but I suppose the most likely cause of death must be poison. The royal household would be full of potential poisons used in medicine, mandrake, poppies, morphine. All of those could have been introduced into the pharaoh's food or drink, and it could have killed him. A good clue is that the chap responsible for the pharaoh's food and drink was listed amongst the plotters. One can't help but feel sad and poignant. Did he die a slow and lingering death at the hands of these harem women, the plotters from the palace, the last people he expected to turn on him?
With the pharaoh out of the way, it was time to follow through on the military takeover of the country and put Ti's son, Pentaworet, on the throne. But there's one other papyrus that gives a crucial clue as to what actually happened next. This is a portion of the Harris Papyrus. This is the title page, so to speak. Lovely image. And this sheds fascinating light on the events that took place after the death of Ramesses. It states that the pharaoh to succeed Ramesses III was Ramesses IV. Ramesses IV was the son of Isis. T's son is not mentioned at all. That's very serious. His name is consigned to oblivion. He's utterly forgotten. Clearly, T's rebellion failed. We don't know why T's plot failed, but it was Isis's son, Ramesses IV, who rounded up the conspirators. The legal documents tell of the trial of T and the others who'd helped her. As well as the women from the harem, the list shows the breadth of the support she'd recruited. It included the head treasurer, the captain of the archers, the commander of the army, the overseer of the king's harem, 2 scribes of the House of Sacred Writings. Presumably, they are the ones who stole the crucial spells. 4 butlers and 6 wives of harem guards, all accused of the plot to overthrow Ramesses III. But even during their trial, the harem women didn't give up the fight. The document shows they actually tried to use their charms on 4 of the trial judges to influence the outcome. It reads, "The women arrived at the abode of the judges and there caroused with them in a drunken orgy. But the wayward judges were caught and had their ears and noses cut off." As for the conspirators, they were all sentenced to death. Most of the forms of capital punishment at the time were fairly horrible. One involved skewering people on a spike and leaving them to die. But because they were aristocrats, T, her son Pentaworit, and the other conspirators were given an easier option. They were allowed to commit suicide, which they did most probably with poison. After this, all mention of T and Pentaworit was chiselled from history. T has no tomb, no statue, engraving or wall painting. In fact, even though she was a pharaoh's wife, the only mention of her name anywhere is in the trial documents. Who would have thought, all those years ago, that such a fragile document, written on papyrus, not stone, would survive all these years and today tell us about these rather dark goings-on? Without the documents, we would have absolutely no idea that T had ever existed, or of her conspiracy to murder a pharaoh. Next time, I'm tracing the dramatic chain of events that brought the ancient Egyptian civilization to an end.